The United States government just made a devastating choice. A choice to deliberately starve its largest reservoir. Right now, as of mid-2026, the agency that controls the entire Colorado River is actively withholding water from Lake Mead, accelerating its decline toward oblivion. They are doing it to save another lake, an upstream reservoir called Lake Powell. That was itself on the verge of collapse. It's a desperate gamble, a catastrophic game of robbing Peter to pay Paul with the water supply of 40 million people. And as you watch this crisis unfold, let me know in the comments below, do you think this was a necessary evil or a fatal mistake? It's a debate happening in real time. Now, a lot of people watch these briefings and forget to do one simple thing that keeps this channel alive. If you value this kind of deep dive reporting and you want to stay ahead of what's coming next, please take 1 second and hit the subscribe button. It's an emergency for us, and it's the only way we can continue to bring you these stories. It truly is that important. Let's begin. This was a decision born from desperation. In early 2026, Lake Powell, the nation's second largest reservoir, was teetering just above its own power generation threshold. Its dam, Glen Canyon Dam, was about to go silent. So, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation made an emergency call. They slashed the amount of water released from Glen Canyon, hoarding it in Lake Powell. It was a move, as UNLV hydrology professor David Creamer put it, to stave off total disaster. But that water was supposed to flow downstream. It was supposed to replenish Lake Mead. That choice, made hundreds of miles away in Arizona, is now sending shockwaves through Nevada, California, and Mexico. Lake Mead's water level, already hovering at a perilous 1,050 feet, has begun to fall. Faster, the move saved Lake Powell. For now. But did it just trade one catastrophe for another? Or did it just push the entire system one step closer to an endgame that no one is prepared for? Because beneath this one impossible choice lies a much deeper problem. A problem measured not in lake levels, but in days. There is a deadline. A hard stop. December 31st, 2026. On that date, the century-old rules that govern the entire Colorado River expire. And vanish. The countdown has already begun. The Colorado River was never what they thought it was. Its entire modern existence is built on a single, catastrophic miscalculation. When 7 state commissioners gathered in Santa Fe, New Mexico, on a cold November day in 1922, they signed a document that would define the American West for the next 100 years. The Colorado River Compact. It was a gentleman's agreement designed to divide the river's bounty between the fast-growing states of the lower basin California, Arizona, and Nevada, and the sparsely populated states of the upper basin Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico. They allocated a staggering 15 million acre-feet of water per year, a number that seemed both fair and sustainable. A number pulled from the river flow data of the previous 2 decades. The problem is, those 2 decades were some of the wettest in the last 1,200 years. They were measuring a flood and calling it average. They had signed a contract promising more water than the river in a normal year could ever deliver. It was not a sustainable system. It never was. For decades, that mathematical error didn't matter. The upper basin states weren't using their full share, and 2 massive reservoirs, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, were built to act as the system's savings accounts. Completed in 1936, Hoover Dam created Lake Mead, a marvel of engineering holding up to 28.23 million acre-feet of water. Glen Canyon Dam followed, creating Lake Powell. Together, they could store 4 times the river's entire annual flow. They were a buffer against reality. But you cannot defy math forever. As the West exploded in population, as millions of acres of farmland were irrigated in arid landscapes, the withdrawals started to exceed the deposits. The savings accounts began to drain. Then came the year 2000, the start of a megadrought, intensified by a warming climate that has now gripped the region for over 25 relentless years. the inflow from the Rocky Mountain snowpack, the river's lifeblood, dwindled. The demand did not. The system was hollowing out from the inside. This isn't just about low water. It's about a political crisis reaching a boiling point. The 7 states that rely on this river are now locked in a bitter, high-stakes negotiation with a non-negotiable deadline. And it is going nowhere. The upper basin states argue they are blameless. The drought is nature's enforcer. They can't use water that doesn't physically arrive in their states. They refuse mandatory cuts. The lower basin states, who consume the vast majority of the water, fire back. This is a shared crisis that demands shared sacrifice. Standing at the center of this firestorm is California, represented by J.B. Hamby, a man tasked with defending his state's claim to the single largest share of the river. He speaks of a historic time of reckoning. He is not wrong. California's position is fortified by a century of water law, a legal framework so old it predates the 1922 Compact itself. As you hear these arguments, the upper basin's plea of natural limits versus the lower basin's demand for shared cuts, who do you think is right? Is there a fair way to divide a shrinking pie? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments. It's a question that will soon be answered, one way or another. Leading the federal agency caught in the middle is Aubrey Betancourt, the newly nominated commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Nominated in June 2026, she is a third-generation California farmer, stepping into what is arguably the most volatile water crisis in American history, just months before the old law's collapse. Before her, Commissioner Camille Kalimlum-Toten famously drew a line in the sand in 2022, demanding the states figure out how to cut up to 4 million acre-feet of use, or the federal government would do it for them. They didn't. And now the clock has almost run out. If no deal is reached by December 31st, the alternative is chaos. Federal intervention on an unprecedented scale. Or, worse, a multi-state legal war that could rage for years in the Supreme Court while the reservoirs themselves run dry. John Berggren of Western Resource Advocates put it bluntly. The system is on a knife's edge between being okay and being in a very scary, catastrophic situation. That knife's edge is measured in feet. 2 numbers that dictate the fate of the entire Southwest. The first number is 950. That is 950 feet above mean sea level. This is the elevation at which Lake Mead hits minimum power pool. At this level, the pressure is no longer great enough to spin the massive hydroelectric turbines inside Hoover Dam. The power stations that generate enough electricity for 1.3 million people go silent. This is not a trivial event. Hoover Dam is a titan of the Western power grid. It provides cheap, reliable baseline power that stabilizes the entire region. Losing it means utilities have to scramble to buy more expensive, often dirtier, power on the open market. It means a grid already strained by summer heat waves loses one of its most critical shock absorbers. The lights don't just go out in Vegas. The cost of keeping them on spikes across 3 states. And this isn't a distant threat. In May 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation's own models predicted the lake could fall below 1,020 feet by summer 2027. Dangerously close. The second number is worse. It is 895. 895 feet. That is the elevation of dead pool, a term that is exactly as final as it sounds. At this level, water physically cannot flow past the dam via gravity. The concrete intakes that send water downstream to Arizona, to California's massive agricultural districts, and to Mexico run dry. The river, for all practical purposes, stops here. This is the point of no return. The moment where a water crisis becomes a humanitarian catastrophe. It means the water supply from major sections of Phoenix and other Arizona cities, which rely on the Central Arizona Project Canal fed by Lake Mead, could be functionally turned off. It means the water that irrigates 5.5 million acres of farmland, growing a huge portion of America's winter vegetables, simply ceases to arrive. The economic fallout isn't measured in billions. It's measured in trillions. The Colorado River Basin underpins a $4 trillion regional economy. Dead pool is the end of the line. And the decision to hoard water upstream in Lake Powell is pushing Mead closer to that line, faster than anyone expected. If this information is valuable to you, if it helps you understand the world just a little bit better, please consider sharing this video with your family and hitting that like button. Awareness is the first step, and a lot of people in these regions don't know the full story. But here is where the story takes a turn no one expects. Here is what they don't tell you. While Arizona and California face the terrifying prospect of their water spigot being turned off at 895 feet, one city will be fine. The one city that shouldn't even exist here. Las Vegas. Las Vegas will not run out of water. Not at minimum power pool. Not even at dead pool. For years, the world has watched Lake Mead shrink, seeing the iconic bathtub ring of white minerals stain the canyon walls. A visual symbol of impending doom for the city of spectacle. But a quiet, audacious engineering project, completed years ago, made that narrative obsolete. In 2015, while the lake was still relatively stable, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, or SNWA, approved a project born of pure paranoia. They saw the long-term trend lines. They understood the flawed math of the 1922 compact. And they planned for a future most people considered science fiction. They decided to build a drain at the very bottom of the lake. It's called the Low Lake Level Pumping Station, connected to a massive 26-foot diameter tunnel known as Intake Number 3. It cost the residents of southern Nevada over $500 million. $522 million. The project involved drilling miles through solid rock to build an intake deep in the lake bed. So deep, it sits near the very bottom. It allows Las Vegas to pump 900 million gallons a day directly out of the lake, entirely bypassing the gravity-fed system of Hoover Dam. So when people talk about dead pool at 895 feet, they are talking about the moment the dam's outlets go dry. They are not talking about Las Vegas. The city's planners, with unsettling foresight, built themselves a lifeboat. They can keep pumping water long after it stops flowing to everyone else downstream. It's an incredible paradox. The city built in the driest desert in North America, the poster child for unsustainable growth, has engineered its way to becoming the most secure water user in the entire lower basin, while farmers in California and subdivisions in Arizona stare at the 895-foot cliff. Las Vegas is watching from a position of relative safety. They bought their survival for $500 million, a tax on existence in an impossible place. I know, you've heard this before, but it's really the only way this works. We get millions of views from people who get incredible value from these deep dives, but most forget to subscribe. If that's you, and you want us to keep going, please, just take a second and click that button. It means everything. The survival of Las Vegas, however, reveals the brutal truth of the Colorado River. The real fight isn't about cities versus nature. It's about who has the oldest piece of paper. The entire system is built on a hierarchy of rights called the law of the river. And at the very top of that hierarchy are entities with something called present perfected rights. These are water rights established before the 1922 compact was even signed. They are the most senior, most legally untouchable rights on the entire river. And they don't belong to the cities. They belong to agriculture. Specifically, to bodies like the Imperial Irrigation District, or ID, in Southern California. The ID holds the single largest and most senior entitlement to Colorado River water. They are legally entitled to receive their full share of water before major cities like Phoenix, or even parts of Los Angeles, receive theirs. This is the brutal, century-old math that governs who gets water and who doesn't. So when you imagine a crisis, don't imagine the Las Vegas Strip going dark. Imagine this. Farmers in the Imperial Valley of California continuing to irrigate vast fields of alfalfa, a thirsty crop often exported to feed cattle overseas, while the taps in suburban Phoenix neighborhoods run dry. That is not an exaggeration. That is the legal reality of the law of the river. This is why California's negotiator, J.B. Hamby, who is also the chairman of the ID's board, holds such a powerful position. He is not just fighting for California's cities. He is defending the ironclad rights of the agricultural district that gets its water first, no matter what. This is the conflict that the December 2026 deadline is forcing into the open. Can a legal framework designed in the 19th century for an agrarian society possibly survive the realities of the 21st century urban West? The states know the math is broken. Even with perfect conservation, there simply is not enough water to satisfy the century-old promises. That's why, in a stunning move on June 3rd, 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation signed a Memorandum of Understanding with Arizona, California, and Nevada. The goal, to urgently explore massive technologically ambitious projects to artificially create new water for the system. They are talking about building large-scale ocean desalination plants and advanced wastewater purification facilities. It's an admission that conservation alone isn't enough. They can't just shrink the demand, they have to somehow increase the supply. But these are multi-billion-dollar projects that take a decade or more to build. They are a solution for 2040, not for the crisis staring them down in 2027. It's a necessary dream, but it's a distant one. In the short term, there is no magic bullet. There is no new water. There is only what's left in the two dwindling reservoirs. And even that is more complicated than it looks. The lake is not just an empty basin waiting for rain. Decades of sediment, washed down the Colorado, have been settling on the bottom, slowly raising the lake floor. Lake Mead is not just losing water from the top, it is losing physical storage capacity from the bottom. The bathtub isn't just emptying, it's getting smaller. Okay, I know, it's the second time. It feels like a commercial break. But look at our analytics. The number of you watching versus the number who subscribe, it's a drought of its own. It takes one click for you, but for us, it determines if we can fund the next investigation. So please, if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. It's so important. Everything comes back to the deadline. December 31st, 2026. Every meeting ends in deadlock. Every proposal is met with a counter-proposal. The upper basin holds firm. The lower basin demands sacrifice. California wields its senior rights like a shield. Arizona, with the most junior rights in the lower basin, faces the most immediate and painful cuts. Nevada, having secured its supply through brute force engineering, plays the role of reformed water user, pointing to its astonishing success in conservation. Since 2002, Las Vegas has slashed its per capita water use by over 40%, all while its population boomed. It recycles nearly all of its indoor water and has outlawed useless ornamental grass. It is a model of urban water discipline. But even that discipline cannot solve the fundamental imbalance of the river itself. As 2026 wears on, the federal government's decision to sacrifice Mead for Powell looks increasingly grim. The short-term fix for the upstream dam has put the entire downstream system on a faster track to its breaking point. All eyes are now on Aubrey Betancourt and the Bureau of Reclamation. If the states cannot forge an agreement by the end of the year, will the federal government finally do what it has threatened for years? Will it impose its own solution? It's a scenario every state wants to avoid. It would trigger an explosion of litigation, tie up the river's management in court for a generation, and create a level of uncertainty that could cripple the region's economy. But the alternative, doing nothing and letting the lakes crash toward dead pool under a set of rules everyone knows are obsolete, is even worse. They are trapped. Trapped by a 100-year-old document written during a flood. Trapped by decades of unchecked growth. Trapped by a climate that is actively rewriting the rules of hydrology in real time. The engineering marvels, the dams, the tunnels, the canals, are monuments to a 20th century belief that nature could be tamed. That belief is now colliding with an unforgiving reality. The crisis on the Colorado River is no longer a slow-moving, abstract problem for the next generation. The decision in April 2026 to cut off Lake Mead's inflow was the sounding of an alarm. It was a signal that the time for gradual adjustments is over. The era of desperate choices has begun. What happens on January 1st, 2027 is utterly unknown. Will it be the beginning of a new, sustainable framework for the American West? Or will it be day one of a collapse that was a century in the making? 40 million people are waiting for the answer. The water in Lake Mead keeps dropping. And there is a number, a single line painted on the canyon walls of the American Southwest, a line that separates survival from catastrophe. And right now, the water is falling toward it. Fast, this isn't a problem for the future. It is a crisis happening today. At this very moment, the largest reservoir in the United States is draining at a rate of billions of gallons per day. A white scar of mineral crust, a bathtub ring, grows wider with every sunrise, marking what is already gone. Every foot the water drops reveals something new. Ghost towns. Forgotten riverbeds. A history long thought buried, now re-emerging into the desert sun. And the latest federal projections are not just concerning. They are dire. A catastrophic plunge is no longer a worst-case scenario. It is now the most probable outcome. A future that was once unthinkable is arriving ahead of schedule. We're breaking down exactly what this new critical level means for 40 million people. Before we do, let us know in the comments what you think the ultimate solution is. Is it even solvable? The theories you have are a critical part of this conversation. Right now, an enormous percentage of the people who watch our documentaries are not subscribed. We get it. You get caught up in the story. But to keep making these deep dives, to keep reporting on urgent stories like this one, we absolutely need your support. It takes 1 second. Click subscribe. It is the single most important thing you can do to make sure this work continues. It's an emergency for this channel, and we need your help. Now, let's begin. The machine has started to fail. That is the simplest way to put it. The Hoover Dam is not just a wall holding back water. It is a gargantuan power plant, a hydroelectric engine that has fueled the growth of the Southwest for nearly a century. An engine that is now sputtering, and the sound is making water managers across 3 states and 1 country profoundly nervous. The problem is elevation. It has always been about elevation. The dam's turbines, 17 of them in total, were engineered for a world where Lake Mead was full, or close to it. They were designed to spin under immense pressure from a massive column of water pressing down from above. But that world is gone. As of mid-June 2026, Lake Mead's water level hovers between 1,046 and 1,049 feet above sea level. Every day, it drops, sometimes 0.15 feet in a single 24-hour period, sometimes more. 1/10 of a foot may not sound like much. But on a reservoir this size, it represents an almost incomprehensible volume of water. Billions of gallons. Gone. Every day. Engineers have a name for the point of no return. Dead pool. For Lake Mead, that number is 895 feet. At that elevation, gravity gives up. The water is too low to flow through the dam's lowest outlets and travel downstream to Arizona, to California, to Mexico. At 895 feet, the river effectively stops. The lower basin goes dry. But the crisis doesn't begin at 895 feet. It begins much, much higher. The number that matters right now is 1,035 feet. That is the hydropower cliff. Tom Bishotsky, the director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources, has been warning about this for years. He is the principal negotiator for a state that stands to lose almost everything. And his assessment is chillingly direct. We're going to go to 1,035, he has stated publicly. There's no question that's going to happen. It is not a guess. It is math. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation's own June 2026 projections, their most probable 24-month study, shows Lake Mead hitting that 1,035-foot mark well before it reaches its projected unprecedented new low of 1,015.77 feet by the summer of 2027. The cliff is directly ahead. Why is 1,035 feet so important? Because 12 of the Hoover Dam's 17 turbines were never designed to operate efficiently below that level. As the water drops, the pressure decreases. The turbines spin slower. The power they generate collapses. Not to zero. Not yet. But the drop-off is extreme. A potential loss of up to 70% of the dam's output. The lights don't all go out at once. They dim. Catastrophically, this isn't just about water anymore. It is an energy crisis hiding in plain sight. The cheap, clean hydropower that has underwritten the Southwest's growth for decades disappears. And it must be replaced. Replaced with power from natural gas plants, from coal, from whatever is available on the open market at peak summer prices. The result is immediate and unavoidable. Electricity bills across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California don't just rise, they spike. Just as the summer heat cranks up and air conditioners are needed most. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation sees what's coming. They are already spending $52 million on a desperate, last-ditch engineering effort to replace the original turbines with new wide-head models. Turbines specifically designed to operate in low-water conditions. It is a remarkable feat of forward-thinking engineering. It is also an admission of defeat. A signal that they do not believe the lake will recover to its historic levels anytime soon. They are retrofitting the ship while it is sinking. It's been 3 minutes, and here's a critical question. Should the federal government step in and force cuts, or should the states be left to negotiate? This is the core of the political battle. Let us know who you think should have the final say in the comments below. The dam was built on a promise. The region was settled on a lie. To understand the crisis of 2026, you have to go back to 1922, to a document that sealed the fate of 40 million people before most of their great-grandparents were even born. The Colorado River Compact. It was an ambitious plan, born of the progressive era's belief that nature could be tamed, that rivers could be quantified, and that the future could be neatly allocated on paper. 7 basin states, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming in the upper basin, Arizona, California, and Nevada in the lower, gathered to divide the river's bounty. They agreed to a total allocation of 15 million acre-feet of water per year, with another 1.5 million later promised to Mexico. There is just one problem. The river they were dividing didn't actually exist. The measurements they used, the flow data they relied on, were taken during one of the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years. It was an anomaly, a statistical fluke. But they treated it as the baseline. They wrote a check that the river could never cash. For decades, the system got by. The great reservoirs, Lake Powell upstream and Lake Mead downstream, acted as massive savings accounts, storing water from the wet years to cover the dry ones. When the Hoover Dam was dedicated by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on September 30th, 1935, it was hailed as a triumph of American ingenuity, a monument to man's ability to make the desert bloom. As Lake Mead began to fill, it submerged entire landscapes, including the small Mormon settlement of St. Thomas. The town's disappearance under the rising blue water was a symbol of progress, of a new era dawning. That era reached its high water mark in July of 1983. For the first and only time in its history, Lake Mead was so full that water flowed over the dam's emergency spillways, carving channels into the canyon walls. That is what full looks like. A force of nature so powerful it had to be bailed out, like an overflowing tub. Then came the year 2000, and the beginning of the end of that world. The start of a multi-decade mega-drought, compounded by rising global temperatures. A drought that scientists like Kevin White at Arizona State University now see as a permanent shift, a process of aridification. The desert wasn't just in a dry spell. The desert was expanding. The optimism of 1922 became the structural deficit of 2002. Since the turn of the millennium, the Colorado River system has been in a state of constant, accelerating collapse. The bathtub ring appeared. The 160-foot decline began. Jennifer Pitt, who directs the Colorado River program for the National Audubon Society, has spent her life on this river. Her words capture the impossible crossroads. We have 19th century law, 20th century infrastructure, and 21st century hydrology and water demand, she says, and it's not lining up very well. It is the most profound understatement in the American West. The system is broken. If you find this analysis valuable, if you think this is a story that needs to be told, please take a moment to like this video and share it, especially with family or friends who live in the affected regions. Awareness is the first step, and sharing this documentary helps put the pressure where it's needed. Thank you. Now, let's get back to the impossible politics. The rules are about to expire. On December 31st, 2026, the entire framework governing the Colorado River, the complex web of agreements known as the 2007 Interim Guidelines and the 2019 Drought Contingency Plans, simply ceases to exist. After that date, there is no plan. There is only chaos. It is a policy cliff that mirrors the hydropower cliff, a man-made deadline for a natural disaster. At the center of this storm is one person, M. Camille Kalimlim Touton. As the Commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, she has arguably the most difficult job in the federal government. It is her responsibility to manage the collapse, to broker a new deal between 7 sovereign states, 40 million people, and a multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry, all while the river itself vanishes beneath their feet. Her message to the states has been brutally clear. The basin is in a structural deficit. The math no longer works. To merely stabilize the reservoirs, to stop the bleeding and keep them from hitting dead pool, the basin needs to permanently cut its water use by a staggering 2 to 4 million acre-feet. Every single year. Forever. That's more water than the entire state of Arizona is entitled to. And the negotiations are going nowhere. The states are gridlocked. California, holding senior water rights from the old law of the river, has been slow to offer significant concessions. Arizona, whose Central Arizona Project canal system faces the most immediate and severe mandatory cuts, argues it has already given enough. The upper basin states worry that if they conserve water, the lower basin will simply take it. It is a perfect storm of self-interest, legal precedent, and profound distrust, all happening on the deck of a sinking ship. The federal government has repeatedly threatened to impose its own solution. If the states cannot reach an agreement by the 2026 deadline, Commissioner Totten and the Department of the Interior may have no choice but to declare an emergency and enforce unilateral, non-negotiable cuts. It is a political nuclear option that no one wants, but one that becomes more likely with every passing day. The clock is not just ticking, it is screaming. I know, this is the second time I'm asking, but it's that important. Just a quick check. Have you hit subscribe yet? No joke. Our analytics shows so many of you watch right to the end and just forget. Think of it as your vote to keep this kind of deep, investigative content alive and well, and not buried under algorithm fluff. Okay, lecture over, for now. The problem is worse than you think. Because the lake isn't just emptying, it's changing. The very chemistry and geology of the reservoir are transforming in ways its builders never foresaw. 3 hidden crises are unfolding beneath the surface, silent, invisible, and deeply destabilizing. First, the container itself is shrinking. When the Hoover Dam was completed, it stopped the natural flow of the Colorado River. It also stopped the flow of silt and sediment the river had carried for millennia. For nearly 90 years, that sediment has been piling up on the floor of Lake Mead. According to geological surveys, the bottom of the lake has risen by approximately 100 feet since 1935. Think about that. While we watch the water surface drop, the lake floor has been silently rising to meet it. The reservoir's total storage capacity is not what it says on the original engineering diagrams. It is significantly less. The glass is smaller than we thought. Second, the water that remains is becoming more toxic. The rock formations of the Southwest are naturally rich in minerals, including arsenic and manganese. For decades, these heavy metals were diluted in the vastness of a full reservoir, present in concentrations so low they were functionally harmless. But as the lake shrinks, the concentrations rise. It's like a boiling pot of soup. As the water evaporates, the salt gets stronger. Local water treatment plants are now detecting spikes in these contaminants in the raw water they pull from the lake. The water requires more complex, more expensive filtration to make it safe to drink. A hidden tax levied by a dying lake. Third, the ground itself is breaking. In parts of the Las Vegas Valley and other nearby communities, the dropping water table connected to the lake is causing the land to physically sink, a process known as subsidence. As underground clays dry out and compact, the surface gives way, creating massive earth fissures, cracks in the desert floor that can be hundreds of feet long and dozens of feet deep. These fissures can sever utility lines, destroy roads, and crack the foundations of homes. It is a slow-motion earthquake, and it is a problem that is almost never covered by standard homeowners insurance. Your house is cracking because a lake 50 miles away is draining, and you are on your own. These are the compounding crises. The threats that don't make the headlines, but add layers of complexity and cost to an already impossible situation. A shrinking container, poisoned water, and broken ground. This is the reality of a system pushed beyond its limits. So who is responsible? For years, the narrative has been simple. The blame has been placed on the sprawling cities of the desert, on the glittering fountains of the Las Vegas Strip, the lush green lawns of Phoenix, the swimming pools of Los Angeles. The solution, we were told, was personal conservation. Take shorter showers. Turn off the tap when you brush your teeth. And for decades, cities have done exactly that. Las Vegas, in particular, has become a world leader in urban water conservation, recycling nearly 99% of its indoor water. And it has not been enough, because the story about the fountains and the swimming pools was always a convenient distraction, a myth. The truth is far more shocking. Roughly 70 to 80% of the Colorado River's water does not go to cities. It does not go to taps or showers or swimming pools. It goes to agriculture. And not just any agriculture. It is used to irrigate 5.5 million acres of farmland, much of it in the middle of the hottest, driest deserts in North America. An enormous portion of that water is used to grow one of the thirstiest crops on Earth, alfalfa. Hay, grown not to feed Americans, but to be harvested, baled, and exported to countries like China and, most ironically, Saudi Arabia. To feed their livestock. Let that sink in. We are draining the lifeblood of the American Southwest, pushing 40 million people toward a water and energy catastrophe. To grow hay in a desert so it can be shipped across the ocean to a kingdom that exhausted its own water resources decades ago. It is a policy so illogical, so profoundly self-destructive, that it feels like a parody. But it is happening right now, at a scale that dwarfs every other part of the conversation. The problem isn't a long shower. The problem is a global supply chain that treats the Colorado River like an infinite, expendable resource. In the face of this unstoppable decline, one city made an audacious, almost cynical, gamble. A city built on impossible odds decided to double down. Las Vegas. While the world focused on its reputation for excess, the city's water managers were quietly preparing for the apocalypse. They saw the numbers. They saw the trend lines. And they decided they would not be the ones to lose. Their solution was a masterpiece of brutal, pragmatic engineering. In 2015, the Southern Nevada Water Authority completed a project known officially as Intake No. 3, but everyone calls it by its more evocative name, the third straw. It was an $817 million tunnel, 23 feet in diameter, drilled for 3 miles through solid rock deep beneath the floor of Lake Mead. Its purpose was simple: to drink from the very bottom of the glass. The first 2 intakes for Las Vegas sat at 1,050 feet and 1,000 feet. The new third straw accesses water at an elevation of 860 feet. Look at that number again, 860 feet. That is 35 feet below the dead pool level of 895 feet, the point at which water stops flowing to Arizona and California. This is the great, terrifying paradox of the Lake Mead crisis. Because of the third straw, Las Vegas will technically be the last city standing. If and when the lake drops to dead pool, when the canals feeding Phoenix and the aqueducts serving Southern California run dry, when Mexico receives nothing, Las Vegas will still be able to pump water. The city that arguably should never have existed has engineered itself to be the ultimate survivor of a crisis it helped create. It was not a solution for the basin. It was a lifeboat for one city, built just big enough for itself. And so we stand here, in the summer of 2026, at the edge of the precipice. The water level sits at 1,046 feet and falling. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the agency in charge, has put the most probable future on paper: 1,015.77 feet by July 2027. A level that will cripple the Hoover Dam's power generation and push the entire system toward a catastrophic failure. All the pieces are in motion. The hydropower cliff is dead ahead. The policy cliff of the 2026 deadline looms, with the states locked in a political death spiral. Hidden crises, sediment, arsenic, subsidence, are quietly accelerating. The agricultural use remains profoundly unsustainable, a gaping wound in the side of the river, and Las Vegas has its lifeboat, ready to float away while its neighbors sink. The narrative of slow, managed decline is over. The coming years will not be about gentle, incremental shortages. They will be about hard choices and brutal consequences. When the water drops below 1,035 feet, who gets the expensive replacement power? When the 2026 deadline passes without a deal, whose water gets cut off first? When the canal to Phoenix can no longer draw water, what happens to the 5th largest city in the country? These are no longer theoretical questions. The clock has run out. The bill for a century of magical thinking is finally coming due. Okay, last time, I promise. If you made it this far, you're clearly as invested in this as we are. If you haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? A personal invitation? Consider this. Please subscribe. It truly makes all the difference. Now, the question remains, is this a managed collapse? Or are we about to witness the system fall apart in real time?
The water is revealing things that were never meant to be seen again. A World War II landing craft, sitting in the mud miles from shore. The entire town of St. Thomas, submerged in 1938, now ghosting back into the sunlight. And inside a rusty barrel, lodged in the sucking clay of Hemingway Harbor, the skeletal remains of a man, shot in the head sometime in the 1970s. A mob hit, buried for decades under billions of gallons of water, until the water wasn't there anymore. Lake Mead is not just shrinking, it is exposing its secrets. It is a time capsule being opened in reverse, and every new discovery, every sunken boat and forgotten foundation, is a warning. This is not a story about a drought. This is a story about a fundamental miscalculation made a century ago, a math error that built the modern American West, and now threatens to unmake it. What do you think is the most shocking thing to be revealed from the shrinking lake? Let us know in the comments below. 7 states, 2 countries, and 40 million people all drink from the same river, and that river is running out of time. So many of you who watch our documentaries say you get lost in the story and forget to subscribe. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. It's a small click, but it's the single most important thing you can do to support this channel and ensure we can keep making these stories. It is an emergency for us. Let's begin. The promise was written on paper on November 24, 1922. They called it the Colorado River Compact. 7 states, desperate to tame the wild artery of the desert, gathered to divide its bounty. They measured the flow, they did the math, and they allocated 15 million acre-feet of water between them. 7.5 million for the upper basin states of Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. 7.5 million for the lower basin states of Arizona, Nevada, and California. Later, another 1.5 million would be promised to Mexico. It was an engineering dream put to paper, a blueprint for turning desert into paradise, for building cities where there was only sand, and growing crops where there was only sun. There was just one problem. The math was wrong. The measurements they used to make that promise, the very flow data that underpinned the entire legal foundation of the American Southwest, were taken during one of the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years. They were basing the future of 40 million people on a flood. They had promised more water than the river actually had. It was a structural deficit, a debt of water that would go unpaid for decades. For a long time, it didn't matter. Hoover Dam rose from the Black Canyon between 1931 and 1936, a monument of concrete and ambition. It pinned the Colorado River and created Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States. Upstream, Glen Canyon Dam would do the same, creating Lake Powell. These 2 reservoirs acted as the nation's water bank accounts for the West. For decades, they held so much water that the original sin of the 1922 Compact was just a footnote in a history book. In 1983, and again in 1999, Lake Mead was essentially full, its water level kissing the 1,229-foot mark. The system worked. The cities grew. The faucets ran. The desert bloomed. It seemed limitless. It was not limitless. It never was. A century-old mistake was about to meet a 21st-century reality, and the evidence of that collision is now etched onto the canyon walls 100 feet high, a white scar on the rock. They call it the bathtub ring. It's not a stain. It's a mineral crust of calcium carbonate, a tombstone marking where the water used to be. Every foot of that ring represents billions of gallons of water, gone. It is the physical proof of a promise the river could never keep. A single river system gives life to a population larger than Canada's. 40 million people depend on the Colorado. It's the water that fills glasses in Los Angeles, irrigates fields in Arizona's Imperial Valley, and keeps the lights on in Phoenix. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend, but it is built on a simple, brutal hierarchy. Not all water rights are created equal. The 1922 Compact and the laws that followed created a complex system of seniority. California got the largest share and the most senior rights. Arizona, particularly the Central Arizona Project, got junior rights. And Nevada, the state home to the glittering oasis of Las Vegas, received the smallest allocation of all. Just 300,000 acre-feet. A sliver. It's one of the most persistent myths of this crisis, that the fountains of the Bellagio and the sprawling resorts of the Las Vegas Strip are the villains. The truth is something else entirely. Nevada takes only about 4% of the river's main allocation, and Las Vegas itself has become a world leader in water conservation. Under the visionary, if sometimes ruthless, leadership of former Water Chief Pat Mulroy, the so-called Water Czarina, the city did something radical. It started paying its residents to tear out their lawns. It passed laws banning ornamental grass. And most importantly, it engineered a system that captures, treats, and returns nearly 99% of all indoor water back to Lake Mead. Every gallon used in a sink, a shower, a toilet, goes back into the lake, where the Southern Nevada Water Authority gets a return flow credit to use it again. It's a closed loop, an act of hydrologic recycling on a metropolitan scale. The real user of the Colorado River is not a city, it's a farm. Somewhere between 70 and 80% of the river's water goes to agriculture, much of it to grow thirsty crops like alfalfa and cotton in the middle of the desert, crops that are often shipped overseas. We are, in effect, exporting the water of the American West, one bale of hay at a time. It's a system that made sense in 1922. It is a system that is pushing the river to the breaking point in 2024. Knowing that agriculture uses 80% of the water, does that change how you view the crisis? Let me know in the comments. The year 2000 was the beginning of the end of the old world. That's when the mega-drought began. Scientists like Park Williams at UCLA would later analyze tree ring data and confirm it. The 22-year period starting in 2000 was the driest stretch the Southwest had seen in at least 1,200 years. And this wasn't a normal drought. This was something different. A fundamental shift in the climate. What scientists call aridification. The region isn't just dry. It is becoming a different place. A hotter, thirstier place. A warmer atmosphere acts like a sponge. It pulls more moisture from the snowpack before it can melt into the river. It sucks more water out of the soil. And on a hot, windy day over Lake Mead, it pulls over 1 billion gallons of water straight into the air through evaporation alone. 1 billion gallons. Gone. Every single day. As the lake fell, the past began to surface. In 2022, the water dropped below 1,050 feet, exposing the city's original water intake valve from 1971. A piece of infrastructure that was supposed to last forever was now high and dry. Then came the boats. A sunken B-29 Superfortress bomber that crashed in 1948. A Higgins-Craft landing boat, the same kind that stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, lost during a survey mission decades ago. These were curiosities. Ghosts from a submerged past. Then came the bodies. On May 1st, 2022, a boater spotted a corroded barrel stuck in the mud. Inside were human remains. Las Vegas Metro Police detectives determined the victim had been shot, likely in the late 1970s or early 80s, stuffed in the barrel and dumped in the lake. It was a classic mob execution, a story straight from the city's dark past. And it was only possible to find because the lake had receded so far, exposing a gravesite that was meant to be permanent. More remains would follow, a grim, forensic accounting of the water level's decline. The lake was falling, and it was taking the region's sense of security with it. Every foot of exposed shoreline was a reminder. The system was failing. For decades, the Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that manages the dams, had operated like a quiet utility. It released water, generated power, and managed a system that seemed to run itself. By June of 2022, that quiet era was over. The agency's commissioner, Camille Kalamlim-Touton, sat before a tense Senate committee and delivered an ultimatum. It was a moment that sent shockwaves through the 7 basin states. She told them they had 60 days. 60 days to come up with a plan to collectively cut their water use by an unprecedented 2 to 4 million acre-feet, an amount so vast it represents nearly the entire annual water use of Arizona and Nevada combined. If the states couldn't agree on how to do it, she warned, the federal government would act unilaterally. It would impose cuts itself. It was a declaration of emergency, a line in the sand. The decades of polite negotiations and incremental steps were over. The system was now so close to failure that the federal government was threatening to take control of the spigot. Think about that for a second. Millions of people, entire state economies, were being threatened with losing the ability to use water that they considered legally theirs. Please, do us a favor and share this video with your family and friends, and make sure to hit that like button. It helps us a lot. The ultimatum set off a brutal, public negotiation. The states, which had spent a century fighting over every drop, were now locked in a room and told to sacrifice. The fault lines were immediate. J.B. Hamby, representing California, pointed to his state's senior water rights, a legal shield that theoretically protected them from the deepest cuts. California argued that those with junior rights should bear the brunt of the pain first. That put Arizona directly in the crosshairs. Tom Bushatsky, the director of Arizona's Department of Water Resources, was in an impossible position. His state's lifeblood, the Central Arizona Project, or CAP, is a 336-mile-long canal that carries Colorado River water to Phoenix and Tucson. But the CAP holds some of the most junior water rights on the entire river. Under existing agreements, Arizona was already facing the largest mandatory cuts. Now, they were being asked for more. For Arizona, this wasn't an abstract negotiation. It was about the survival of its 2 largest cities. And then there was Nevada, represented by John Ensminger, the pragmatic head of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Nevada had the smallest allocation, but the most to lose in terms of perception. Ensminger had been sounding the alarm for years, continuing the work of his predecessor, Pat Mulroy. He pointed to Las Vegas's aggressive conservation and recycling programs. He argued that his state was already doing more with less than anyone else. They had seen this crisis coming. They had spent billions to prepare. In 2020, years before Teuton's ultimatum, Las Vegas had completed one of the most audacious engineering projects in modern American history. They called it the third straw. Knowing their two existing water intakes would one day be left stranded by the falling lake, the city spent $1.5 billion to drill a new tunnel, 3 miles long, bored through solid rock, deep beneath the floor of Lake Mead itself. It terminated at an intake structure, sitting at an elevation of 860 feet. That number is critical. It is below the 895-foot mark of dead pool, the point at which water can no longer flow past Hoover Dam. It was an insurance policy against the apocalypse, a way for Las Vegas to keep pulling water even if the reservoir had functionally collapsed. The project was proof that Nevada took the threat seriously, but it didn't create new water. It just secured access to the last drops of the old. The 60-day deadline came and went. The states failed to reach an agreement. The fight was no longer about managing a river. It was about allocating a shortage that was accelerating toward a series of terrifying thresholds. There are numbers that keep water managers awake at night. They aren't projections. They are elevations, points of no return etched into the engineering of the dams themselves. The first is the minimum power pool. At Hoover Dam, this level is around 950 feet above sea level. Below this elevation, the water pressure is no longer great enough to spin the massive turbines that generate electricity for millions of people across Nevada, Arizona, and California. Power production doesn't just decline, it stops entirely. By 2022, with the lake at 1,040 feet, power generation had already dropped by a third. The dam was getting weaker. The power pool was no longer a theoretical danger. It was the next stop on the way down. The second number is the one that means catastrophe, 895 feet. This is dead pool. At this elevation, the water level in Lake Mead drops below the lowest outlets in Hoover Dam. Water can no longer pass through the dam by gravity. Nothing flows downstream. The river, for all intents and purposes, stops. California, Arizona, and Mexico would be cut off. The system, as it has existed for nearly a century, would cease to function. In late July of 2022, Lake Mead hit its record low, 1,040.71 feet, just 45 feet above the level where power generation would begin to shut down. Just 145 feet above total system failure. 2 decades of drought had drained the reservoir to just over a quarter of its capacity. A lake that was supposed to be a symbol of American ingenuity had become a symbol of its vulnerability. The bathtub ring was no longer a curiosity. It was a countdown clock. The federal government, facing the state's failure to agree, declared a Tier 2A shortage for 2023. The cuts became deeper. Arizona would lose over 500,000 acre-feet of its water, more than a fifth of its total allocation. Nevada would lose 25,000 acre-feet. The machinery of the shortage protocol was grinding forward, forcing conservation through brute force cuts. The system was working as designed in a crisis, but the crisis was outpacing the design. The projections showed the lake continuing to fall through 2023 and 2024, pushing ever closer to the power pool and dead pool triggers. The West was staring into the abyss. And then, the weather changed. The winter of 2022-2023 was not normal. It was biblical, a series of powerful atmospheric rivers, plumes of immense moisture drawn from the Pacific, slammed into the western United States one after another. They dumped record-breaking snow on the Rocky Mountains, the headwaters of the Colorado River. The snowpack in the upper basins swelled to levels not seen in decades, in some places exceeding 150% of the median. As spring arrived, the great melt began. Torrents of water, the lifeblood of the river, poured into the parched system. Lake Powell, the upstream reservoir that had been flirting with its own power pool crisis, began to rise dramatically. Water managers at the Bureau of Reclamation made a critical decision: release more water than planned from Glen Canyon Dam down to Lake Mead. The effect was stunning. Lake Mead, which had been in a terrifying freefall, began to climb. It rose over 20 feet in a matter of months. Boat ramps that had been acres from the water's edge were submerged again. The shoreline crept back up the canyon walls, covering the lower portions of the bathtub ring. The media headlines were jubilant. The drought was over. The crisis was averted. For a moment, the entire region exhaled. It was a reprieve. It was not a solution. Scientists and veteran water managers urged caution. One wet winter, they warned, does not erase 23 years of drought. The reservoirs were still less than half full. The massive structural deficit, the gap between what was promised in 1922 and what the river actually provides, remained. Climate scientist Brad Udall at Colorado State University put it simply: the atmosphere itself is now thirstier, and it's pulling more water out of the system before it ever reaches the reservoirs. The long-term trend was unchanged. The unexpected bounty did something crucial, however. It bought time. It pushed the immediate threat of Deadpool off the table. In May 2023, with the specter of federal intervention still hanging over them, and the temporary relief of a wet winter providing political cover, the three lower basin states finally did what they had failed to do a year earlier. Arizona, Nevada, and California announced a landmark consensus deal. They agreed to voluntarily conserve an additional 3 million acre-feet of water by the end of 2026. In exchange, they would receive over $1 billion in federal funding from the Inflation Reduction Act to compensate farmers and districts for fallowing land and improving efficiency. It was a historic compromise, a temporary truce in a century-long water war, but the deal itself was another sign of the new reality. They weren't dividing a surplus. They were paying people not to use water that no longer existed. It was an admission that the river was permanently smaller. By the way, I know this is the second time I'm asking, but the data tells us that a huge number of you who love our content are not subscribed. We need you. Hitting subscribe is the fuel that lets us spend hundreds of hours on research and scripting for videos like this one. It's an emergency for independent channels like ours. Please, take 1 second and click that button. It means the world. The temporary peace bought by the 2023 winter and the subsequent state deal has shifted the focus to the final showdown, the renegotiation of the rules that will govern the river after 2026. Everything is on the table. The foundational assumptions of the 1922 Compact, the concept of seniority, the massive allocation for agriculture, the very way water is valued and used across the West. The fundamental conflict has not changed. California still holds the most powerful legal rights. Farmers in places like the Imperial Valley see any reduction as an existential threat to their livelihood and to the nation's food supply. Cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas argue that you can't dry up metropolitan areas of millions of people, regardless of who has senior rights. It is a collision of law, economics, and the basic human need for water. What happens if the next drought is not 23 years long, but 50? Paleoclimate research, drawn from ancient tree rings, shows that the Colorado River Basin has endured megadroughts in the past that make our current crisis look mild. The period that the 1922 Compact was based on appears more and more not just as a wet period, but as a profound anomaly. The architects of the West built their world during a flood. We are now living in the drought that followed. The engineering that defined the 20th century, the massive dams, the sprawling canals, can only manage the water that is there. It cannot create it. Solutions for the 21st century look radically different. Large-scale desalination plants, though brutally expensive and energy-intensive. Advanced water recycling that turns sewage into drinking water, a concept once dismissed as toilet to tap, but now being adopted by cities across the Southwest. And, most contentiously, a permanent reduction in agricultural water use, forcing a rethinking of what we grow and where we grow it. Las Vegas's third straw is a perfect metaphor for this moment, an incredible feat of engineering, a desperate, multi-billion-dollar gamble to reach the last accessible drops of a dwindling supply. It guarantees that Las Vegas will have water even if Hoover Dam goes dry. But it does nothing for the 38 million other people on the river. It does nothing for the farmers in Arizona. It does nothing for the households in Los Angeles. It is an act of municipal survival, not regional salvation. The crisis has been temporarily paused. The water level in Lake Mead stabilized, hovering around 1,066 feet in early 2024, about 34% full. The immediate danger has passed, but the bathtub ring remains, a 160-foot reminder of how much is missing. It's a physical monument to a system that is still over-allocated, overused, and living on borrowed time. The wet winter of 2023 was a lucky break, a moment of grace. It was not a solution. The river is still draining, just more slowly now. The clock is still ticking, it just has a few more years on it. The negotiations for what happens after 2026 will determine the future of the American West. It will be a fight over scarcity, a fight over who gets to survive and who will be forced to sacrifice. Every solution is painful. Every outcome will create winners and losers, and all of it will happen under the shadow of a hotter, drier climate that is fundamentally changing the rules of the game. The water that buried a mobster's secrets for 40 years is gone. The question now is whether the society built on that water will disappear with it. I know we've bugged you a couple of times, but if you've made it this far, you are clearly one of the most dedicated viewers on the platform, and for that, we need your help. If you haven't yet, please subscribe. It's the only way we beat the algorithm and continue telling stories this important. It's a click for you, but it's a lifeline for us. Thank you. The 20th century was about conquering the Colorado. The 21st will be about learning to live with what's left of it. The engineering marvels of the past, Hoover, Glen Canyon, were built with a certainty that now feels naive. The belief that nature could be bent to human will, indefinitely. That belief is now gone, evaporated into the desert air, along with trillions of gallons of water. The future will require a different kind of ingenuity. Not just engineering, but humility. The humility to accept that the river is not what it once was, and the courage to make decisions that reflect that new, harsher reality. The story of Lake Mead is the story of us, facing a catastrophic failure is happening right now, in plain sight, at the heart of the American West. And it's not what you think. This isn't about a drought. This is about a design flaw, a kill switch, embedded in the architecture of the second largest dam in the United States, that is about to permanently sever the lifeline for 40 million people. The dam was built to control a river. It is now poised to become a wall, a 710-foot-tall concrete blockade with no way through. Right now, an astonishing number of our viewers are not subscribed. If you value this kind of deep dive reporting, take 1 second to hit that subscribe button. It is the single most important way to support this channel, and it guarantees you won't miss what we uncover next. Let's begin. The engine of the crisis is a single number, 3,490 feet. That is the elevation of Lake Powell's minimum power pool, the precise water level at which the 8 massive hydroelectric turbines inside Glen Canyon Dam can no longer operate. Below that, the lights go out for 5 million people. But that's not the real disaster. The real disaster happens 120 feet lower. At an elevation of 3,370 feet, the reservoir hits dead pool. The point where water can no longer pass through the dam to reach Lake Mead, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and the farms that feed America. And the fail-safe system designed to get water through during a blackout? It's broken. We know it's broken because the federal government admitted it. In a quiet internal memo, they confirmed the dam's emergency bypass tubes are damaged, unreliable, and cannot be used. The catastrophic flaw has been exposed. The kill switch is active, and the lake is now just feet away from triggering it. This wasn't a sudden accident. It was a mathematical certainty, set in motion a full century ago. The story begins not in the canyons of Arizona, but in a hotel in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The date was November 24, 1922. The architects of the modern West, led by a determined Secretary of Commerce named Herbert Hoover, gathered to divide the waters of the Colorado River. They authored the Colorado River Compact, the foundational law of the river, a document that would enable the construction of colossal dams, the irrigation of millions of acres of desert, and the growth of cities that should never have existed. They divided the river's annual flow equally between the upper and lower basins, allotting a generous 7.5 million acre-feet of water to each, enough to build a civilization. There was just one problem. The water they were dividing didn't exist. Not in the quantities they believed. The measurements used to draft the compact were taken during one of the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years, an anomalous, freakishly wet decade that painted a dangerously optimistic portrait of what the river could provide. Modern tree ring data, analyzed by researchers like Brad Udall and Eric Kuhn, proves the truth they couldn't see. The river's long-term average flow is closer to 13 million acre-feet per year, not the 16.4 million the compact was based on. Today, with a 21st century megadrought fueled by a changing climate, that number is closer to 12 million. The 7 states of the American West wrote checks for water that legally exists on paper, but physically does not exist in nature. Every year, for 100 years, the basin has been running a deficit. A water debt that has been quietly accumulating. And Lake Powell is where the bill is finally coming due. Glen Canyon Dam, the physical manifestation of that 1922 promise, was an act of audacious, almost arrogant, engineering. Construction began in 1956. For 8 years, crews blasted and poured, transforming a remote stretch of the Colorado River in Coconino County, Arizona, into a monument of concrete and steel. When the gates were finally closed in 1964, the river began to back up, slowly drowning 186 miles of psychedelic sandstone canyons. It took 17 years for Lake Powell to fill for the first time. 17 years of the Colorado River's full, unimpeded flow. A volume of water that is almost impossible to imagine today. The dam was a triumph of 20th century ambition, built to tame a river and secure a future for millions. But it was built on a lie, a mathematical error, and a structure built on a flawed foundation will, eventually, fail. The question was never if, it was when. The dam gave its first warning not during a drought, but during a flood, a terrifying preview of its own vulnerability. In June of 1983, a massive, unexpected snowpack across the Rocky Mountains melted in a sudden heat wave, sending a torrent of water careening down the Colorado River. Lake Powell began to rise at a rate that terrified engineers. The reservoir, designed for control, was out of control. To prevent the lake from overtopping the dam itself, an event that would have been cataclysmic, operators had to open the dam's 2 emergency spillway tunnels for the first time ever. These were concrete tubes, 41 feet in diameter, bored through the cliffs on either side of the dam. They were the release valve, the last line of defense, and they were about to be destroyed. As water moving at speeds over 150 feet per second screamed through the tunnels, a physics phenomenon known as cavitation began to occur. The sheer velocity of the water caused its pressure to drop so low that it literally boiled at ambient temperature, forming countless tiny vapor bubbles. As these bubbles moved into zones of higher pressure, they didn't just pop, they imploded. They collapsed with the force of microscopic jackhammers, unleashing temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun and shockwaves powerful enough to tear apart steel. Within hours, the spillways were vibrating violently. The imploding bubbles were ripping out chunks of the 3-foot-thick, steel-reinforced concrete like it was chalk. A low rumble grew into a roar that could be heard and felt for miles. Engineers realized the spillways were tearing themselves apart from the inside. If they failed completely, the uncontrolled erosion could eat its way back to the dam's foundation, threatening the entire structure. What does it feel like to be on the front lines of an engineering crisis that could wipe a city off the map? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The scene in Page, Arizona, was one of controlled panic. With the spillways failing, engineers scrambled for a desperate, almost unbelievable solution. They drove to the local lumber yard and bought all the plywood they could find. Back at the dam, crews worked frantically to bolt the sheets of wood onto the tops of the massive steel spillway gates, creating crude, 8-foot-tall flashboards to hold back just a few more feet of the rising lake. They were fighting a trillion-gallon reservoir with plywood. For weeks, the fate of the dam and everything downstream hung in the balance. Eventually, the inflow slackened, the plywood held, and the crisis passed. The subsequent investigation revealed cavities in the concrete spillways as large as 35 feet deep and 150 feet long. The physics of cavitation had almost won. And here is the unsettling truth. The exact same force that nearly destroyed Glen Canyon Dam during a record flood is the single greatest threat to its survival during a record drought. Fast forward to 2026. There is no flood. There is a snow drought. An abysmal winter has left the Rocky Mountain snowpack at a fraction of its normal depth. The Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, the agency whose data determines the fate of the West, issued its spring runoff projection. Just 22% of average. The inflow into Lake Powell will be a trickle, not a river. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation's own 24-month study, the official projection of the lake's future, confirms the consequence. By December 2026, for the first time in its 60-year history, Lake Powell is projected to fall below 3,490 feet. It will enter minimum power pool. The hydropower plant will go dark. But the real crisis begins the moment the turbines stop spinning. To keep water flowing to the 40 million people in the lower basin, the Bureau of Reclamation will have no choice but to open the dam's last-ditch plumbing. 4 steel pipes near the base of the dam called the river outlet works. These are the bypass tubes, and this is where the ghost of 1983 returns. Because when you force high volumes of gritty, sediment-filled water through narrow pipes at low lake levels, physics gets vengeful. You get cavitation. And the Bureau of Reclamation knows it. If this analysis is giving you a new perspective on the West's water crisis, do us a huge favor and share this video with your family and friends. And while you're at it, hitting that like button really helps the channel. On March 26, 2024, the government quietly admitted the dam's kill switch was broken. In a bombshell internal memo, Richard Lafond, the director of the Bureau's Technical Service Center, laid out the findings from a 2023 high-flow experiment on those exact bypass tubes. The results were alarming. The memo stated that long-term operation of the river outlet works will result in accelerating regular operation and maintenance. It was bureaucratic language for a terrifying reality. The tests caused cavitation damage. The pipes were being eaten from the inside, just like the spillways in 1983. The memo confirmed that these tubes, the only way to get water to Lake Mead once the power plant shuts down, cannot be relied upon for the continuous, high-volume flows the lower basin needs to survive. This is the infrastructure paradox. The very structure built to guarantee the West's water supply is now the physical bottleneck that could choke it off. Once the lake drops below 3,490 feet, a terrifying sequence begins. First, the power generation stops. The 1,320 megawatt power plant goes dark, cutting off electricity to nearly 5 million people and, just as critically, eliminating the revenue that funds environmental restoration programs all along the Colorado River. The system starts to eat itself. Then, with the turbines offline, federal operators must rely solely on the damaged bypass tubes, pushing them to their limits, knowing that every gallon that passes through them is causing more internal damage, accelerating the moment of total failure. For 120 vertical feet, the terrifying gap between power pool and dead pool, the dam will function as a broken valve, draining the last accessible water from Lake Powell to keep Lake Mead from crashing. But the bypass tubes were never designed for this role. They were designed for intermittent supplemental releases, not to function as the river's main artery. Pushing them to run non-stop is a gamble with physics. A gamble Richard Lafond's memo suggests they are doomed to lose. The final stop is 3,370 feet. Dead pool. The point at which the water level drops below the intake for even the lowest bypass tubes. At that point, it doesn't matter how damaged the pipes are. They go dry. The flow downstream to Lake Mead stops. Not a reduction. Not a cutback. It stops. Completely. Glen Canyon Dam becomes a 710-foot plug. A concrete wall holding back a stagnant, inaccessible puddle, while a riverbed on the other side runs dry. That is when the water supply for Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Los Angeles effectively ceases to exist. That is when the 5.5 million acres of farmland that grow the majority of America's winter vegetables turn to dust. That is the domino effect. The people in charge are now in a state of open desperation. Camille Calamlim-Touton, the commissioner for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, has been forced into the role of financial and political executioner, delivering ultimatums to the 7 basin states to cut their water usage by millions of acre-feet. She speaks of management based on best available science, which is a diplomatic way of saying the cuts are no longer negotiable. The math has run out. In a move of sheer desperation, the feds have now turned to the reservoirs upstream of Powell. In an emergency action announced in June 2026, the USPR began dumping an extra million acre-feet of water from Flaming Gorge Reservoir, which straddles the Wyoming-Utah border, sending it downstream to artificially prop up Lake Powell's levels. It is a frantic, last-ditch attempt to keep the turbines spinning for just a few more months. They are robbing an upstream savings account to delay the inevitable bankruptcy downstream. It is not a solution. It is a headline. The failure of the bypass tubes has ignited an even more radical conversation inside the Bureau of Reclamation. They are now actively investigating engineering overhauls so extreme they sound like science fiction. The leading proposal? Drilling entirely new bypass tunnels, not through the dam, but through the solid bedrock of the canyon walls around it. A multi-billion-dollar emergency surgery to create a permanent bypass, getting water around the failing structure entirely. It's a plan that mirrors the Third Straw project in Las Vegas, another monumentally expensive effort to drill deeper to chase a disappearing resource. It's a tacit admission that the original design of Glen Canyon Dam is fundamentally broken for the climate of the 21st century. There's a growing chorus of voices, like the Glen Canyon Institute, a prominent environmental nonprofit, arguing for an even more radical idea. Stop trying to fix the dam. Instead, bypass it permanently and begin the process of draining Lake Powell. Let the Colorado River run free through Glen Canyon for the first time in 60 years. Their argument is simple and sharp. The reservoir is a climate catastrophe, losing hundreds of thousands of acre-feet to evaporation every year. The dam, a flawed piece of 20th century technology. In an era of sustained drought, the single most effective way to save water might be to get rid of the structure built to store it. Alright, I know this is the second time I'm asking, but the data shows a ton of you who love these deep dives forget to subscribe. It takes one click, it costs you nothing, and it makes a world of difference for us. If you're still here, you're clearly one of the dedicated ones. So please, make it official and hit that subscribe button. We'd really appreciate it. The crisis has even forced the town of Page, Arizona, a city that literally exists only because the dam was built, to re-engineer its own survival. The town's municipal water intake pulls directly from the dam. In 2023, with the lake plummeting, the Oosber had to urgently drill a new, lower intake pipe because the city was on the verge of its water supply dropping below its own valves. The dam was failing its own company town. The West is now confronting the impossible reality that Jennifer Pitt of the National Audubon Society succinctly described. We have 19th century law, 20th century infrastructure, and 21st century hydrology and water demand, and it's not lining up very well. It's an elegant summary of a chaotic collapse. The law of 1922 promised water that isn't there. The infrastructure of 1964 is breaking under conditions it was never designed to handle. And the hydrology of 2026 is rewriting the rules faster than anyone can respond. The future of Glen Canyon Dam is now a series of terrible choices. Do we spend billions on new tunnels to patch a failing system? Do we drain smaller reservoirs upstream to buy a few more months of power? Or do we face the most uncomfortable question of all? Was building this dam here, in this way, based on that flawed 1922 math, one of the single greatest ecological and engineering blunders in American history? The dam stands silent, a monument of concrete and hubris, baked in the Arizona sun. It was built as a symbol of humanity's mastery over nature, a machine to power the future. Now, it's a broken gear in a system collapsing under the weight of its own history. The water keeps dropping, the turbines are slowing, and the only thing standing between 40 million people and a dry riverbed is a set of damaged pipes that are eating themselves alive. The clock is no longer ticking. There is a deadline, a non-negotiable, scientifically calculated date for the collapse of an entire ecosystem. January 2023, a team of scientists, led by Dr. Benjamin Abbott at Brigham Young University, issued an emergency warning. Without drastic, immediate intervention, the Great Salt Lake, the largest saline lake in the Western Hemisphere, would functionally disappear by the year 2028. Not a shortage, not a restriction. Gone. Leaving behind a toxic dust bowl laced with arsenic and mercury, aimed directly at a major American city. This is not a distant climate model. It is a 4-year fuse on an environmental bomb. But here's what they didn't tell you. The Great Salt Lake is not an anomaly. It is a preview. Across the American West, 7 iconic bodies of water are now caught in the same death spiral. From reservoirs that power cities to lakes that once defined entire regions, the water is vanishing faster than any model predicted. So, the real question is, are we witnessing a historic drought, or are we watching the first stage of a man-made apocalypse that we engineered ourselves? What do you believe is the root cause of this crisis? Is it climate change, overpopulation, or century-old water policies that no longer work? Let me know your honest opinion in the comments. I read as many as I can. And let's begin. A surprising number of people who find this information vital forget to subscribe. If you believe these stories need to be told, taking 2 seconds to hit that notification bell is the single best way to support this work. It ensures these warnings are seen by more people, a small click for a massive issue. The problem begins in Utah, at the Great Salt Lake. For most of its history, it was a constant, a vast, shimmering expanse of saline water so large it created its own local weather patterns. Today, more than half of its natural area is gone. The lake has lost 73% of its water and dropped 11 feet since 1850. Most of that loss has occurred in just the last 20 years. The vast exposed lake beds are not just empty land. They are the accumulation of a century of agricultural and industrial runoff. Arsenic, selenium, mercury, and other heavy metals that were safely diluted in trillions of gallons of water are now sitting on the surface, exposed to the air. Every windstorm that sweeps across the valley now has the potential to pick up this toxic particulate matter and blow it directly into the lungs of the 1.2 million people living in Salt Lake City and the surrounding suburbs. Dr. Benjamin Abbott and his team at BYU were blunt in their 2023 report. The issue is, there is a very, very short fuse on this, and the lake is within just a few years of collapse, he stated. The cause is not a mystery. It's simple math. Decades of diverting the rivers that feed the lake for agriculture and municipal use, combined with a warming climate, have created a structural deficit. More water is being taken out than nature can possibly put back in. Around 65% of the water diverted from the Great Salt Lake Basin goes to one industry, agriculture, specifically for water-intensive crops like alfalfa and hay, much of which is exported overseas. It is the textbook definition of exporting your water supply, one bale of hay at a time. For a moment, it seemed like the warning was being heard. In an unexpected political shift, Donald Trump's 2027 fiscal budget proposal requested over $1 billion to secure the lake's future, an unprecedented federal intervention. But is it too late? Can $1 billion refill a lake that took millennia to form? Or is it just the most expensive dust suppression project in history? The clock to 2028 is still ticking. 400 miles south, a different kind of catastrophe is unfolding, but with the same brutal math. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the two largest reservoirs in the United States, are the lifeblood of the American Southwest. They provide water and power to nearly 40 million people across 7 states and Mexico. Both are impounded on the same river, the Colorado, and both are draining at a terrifying rate. The iconic bathtub ring on Lake Mead's canyon walls tells the story, a stark white scar showing how far the water has fallen. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that manages these behemoths, has stopped speaking in hypotheticals. Their official projections, released in June 2026, are grim. They forecast Lake Mead's water level to plummet to 1,020 feet by July of 2027. That is 30 feet below its current level. And it's dangerously close to a number that terrifies water managers. 950 feet. That's the minimum power pool threshold, the point at which the water level is too low to turn the turbines at Hoover Dam. Below that, the dam stops generating electricity for millions in Nevada, Arizona, and California. The lights go out. Is this just a natural cycle, or something more permanent and irreversible? Let me know your take in the comments below. But there is a lower number still, 895 feet. That is dead pool. It's not a dramatic term. It's a technical one. It means the water is physically too low to flow past the dam at all. A dead pool Lake Mead means the Colorado River effectively stops flowing south of Hoover Dam. The city of Las Vegas, as we covered in a previous investigation, spent $1.4 billion drilling a third straw to pull water from the very bottom of the lake, below the dead pool line, an act of engineering desperation. And yet, even that tunnel doesn't solve the problem if the river that fills the lake stops delivering. Upstream, Lake Powell is hovering at a catastrophic 24% capacity. What happens at Powell directly determines what happens at Mead. They are two dominoes in the same line, and the first one is already wobbling. The good snowpack of winter 2023 gave a moment of reprieve, a slight bump in water levels that some mistook for recovery. It wasn't. It was a temporary pause in a decades-long decline. The structural deficit, where states are allocated more water than the river actually carries, remains. It's a century-old accounting error, written in 1922, coming due in the 21st century. Then there is the lake that was born by mistake and is now dying by neglect. The Salton Sea, California's largest lake, was created in 1905. It was an engineering disaster. The powerful Colorado River, swollen with floodwaters, breached an irrigation canal and poured into a low-lying desert basin called the Salton Trough. For 2 years, the entire volume of the river flowed into the desert, creating a vast inland sea, an accidental oasis. For decades, it thrived. It became a hotspot for tourism, boating, and sport fishing, a desert riviera. But the Salton Sea has no natural outlet. Water goes in, but it only leaves through evaporation. Over a century, agricultural runoff from the surrounding Imperial Valley, full of pesticides and fertilizers, poured into the lake. With nowhere to go, the salinity skyrocketed and the pollutants concentrated. Today, the Salton Sea is an apocalyptic landscape. The shoreline is littered with the bones of millions of tilapia, fish that could no longer survive the toxic, hypersaline water. The air is thick with the smell of decay. And as the lake shrinks, it is exposing that same toxic lakebed we see in Utah, but with its own unique chemical cocktail. The federal government knows the danger. The Inflation Reduction Act allocated $250 million, $250 million, specifically for dust suppression projects at the Salton Sea. Not to save the lake, but to try and stop the lake from poisoning the millions of people who live in the region, from the Imperial Valley all the way to Los Angeles. That money isn't a solution. It's a bandage on a wound that is only getting deeper. The Salton Sea is a ghost of a lake, a warning of what happens when a water source is abandoned. It's a reminder that sometimes the most expensive problem is the one you ignore. If this is the first time you're hearing about the true scale of this toxic dust threat, hit the like button. Knowledge is the first step, and if you have family in California or Utah, share this video. They have a right to know what is in the air they breathe. Your share could be the warning someone needs. West of the Salton Sea, in the high desert of Nevada, another ghost is forming: Walker Lake. Unlike the Salton Sea, Walker Lake wasn't an accident. It's an ancient terminal lake, a natural jewel in the Great Basin, that for generations was a premier fishing destination. The economy of Mineral County was built on it. Today, the fish are gone. All of them. As upstream agricultural diversions on the Walker River siphoned off its inflow for decades, the lake's water level dropped and its salinity soared. Sometime around 2015, the last native trout died. Tony Ruse, a Mineral County commissioner who has watched this collapse unfold his entire life, put it bluntly. The last fish was caught in 2013 or 2015. When the fish died, the fishing died. Boating, recreation, that all just disappeared. What was once a vibrant blue lake is now described by locals as a sludge pond. The marinas sit high and dry, hundreds of yards from the water's edge, their ramps pointing to a cracked, empty lakebed. The town of Walker Lake is a shadow of its former self. Its economy evaporated along with the water. Organizations like the Walker Basin Conservancy are fighting a desperate battle to buy water rights from farmers and restore flow to the river. But they are competing against a century of established agricultural practice and water law. Walker Lake isn't a story of a future threat. It's the story of a loss that has already happened. It is the tangible, economic, and ecological wreckage that is left behind when a lake dies. It serves as a living obituary for what towns across the West now fear is their own future. A future where the central feature of their community, the very reason for their existence, simply vanishes. You can't build an economy on sludge. You can't run a bait shop when there are no fish. Walker Lake is the quiet, devastating proof. The crisis is not confined to natural terminal lakes. In New Mexico, one of the most important reservoirs on the Rio Grande is in a state of near-total failure. Elephant Butte Reservoir, completed in 1916, was once the largest man-made lake on Earth. It was a monumental achievement of its time, designed to control the wild floods of the Rio Grande and provide a reliable water supply for farms in southern New Mexico and West Texas. In late June of 2026, it held just 4.7% of its conservation capacity, nearly empty. The cause was a brutal combination of factors. A multi-year drought had already depleted the reservoir. Then came the winter of 2026, which produced a meager snowpack in the mountains that feed the Rio Grande. Worse, that snow melted far earlier than ever recorded in 30 years. A sudden warm spell in the spring caused the entire snowpack to liquefy and rush downstream all at once, forcing dam operators to release massive amounts of water to prevent flooding. It was a deluge they couldn't capture, a feast during a famine. In June, the outflow from Elephant Butte Dam was measured at 15 times higher than the inflow from the river. 15 times. The reservoir was bleeding out, hemorrhaging water to meet downstream treaty obligations with Texas and Mexico. John Irizarry, The acting area manager for the Bureau of Reclamation's Albuquerque office acknowledged the dire situation. Being faced with a third dry year in a row is a big challenge, he said in April 2026, trying to sound confident. But confidence can't create water. The Elephant Butte Irrigation District, which manages water for thousands of acres of farmland, has had its allocations slashed year after year. Farmers are forced to let fields go fallow, to abandon crops, to make impossible choices. The reservoir that was meant to be their salvation has become a symbol of their precarity. When a lake this size drops to 4.7%, it isn't a reservoir anymore. It's a puddle at the bottom of a canyon, a ghost of the water security it once promised. And it's a stark illustration of how a single good snow year doesn't fix a 2-decade-long drought. The system is too broken. The deficit is too deep. I know it's the second time I'm asking, but our data shows a surprising number of you watch these urgent warnings and simply forget. If you've made it this far, the story clearly has you hooked. Let's make it official. That subscribe button costs you nothing, but it helps us get these critical documentaries in front of the people who need to see them most. It's important. Perhaps the most bizarre and infuriating story of collapse comes from the Texas Hill Country, Medina Lake. Built in 1913, it was once the largest dam in Texas and the fourth largest in the entire United States. A marvel of private engineering. In early June 2026, Medina Lake hit a staggering 3.9% capacity. But it's not just the drought that's killing this lake. It's the ground beneath it. The Medina Dam was built directly on top of the Glen Rose limestone outcrop of the Edwards Aquifer. It's a porous, fractured, honeycombed rock formation. From the very beginning, the lake was a giant leaky sieve. It was physically incapable of holding water long term. A huge portion of its volume has always bled directly into the aquifer below, a fact the original engineers knew and largely ignored. But the insanity doesn't stop there. The water that is released from the dam for agricultural use enters a system of irrigation canals that are over 110 years old. These are not modern, concrete-lined aqueducts. They are largely earthen ditches carved into the ground a century ago. The entity that manages them, the Bexar Medina Atascosa County's Water Control and Improvement District No. 1, or BMA, oversees a system so decrepit that by their own admission, an estimated 75% of the water released from the dam is lost. It seeps into the ground through the leaky canals before ever reaching the single farmer it was intended for. 75%. For every 4 gallons released, 3 are wasted. It's a system designed for failure. And now, in the face of a historic drought, that engineered failure has become a full-blown catastrophe. The lake is disappearing into the ground it sits on and evaporating from the ditches it flows through. It is a 1-2 punch of geological bad luck and infrastructural malpractice. And the people who live around the lake, who built their homes and businesses on its shores, can only watch as it drains away, a victim of a crisis that was literally built into its foundation over 100 years ago. So who is to blame? It is easy to point fingers at citizens taking long showers or watering their lawns. And while residential conservation is important, it is a rounding error in the grand scheme of things. It's a distraction. The data, from the Great Salt Lake to the Colorado River Basin, is unequivocal. The vast majority of water in the American West, between 65% and 80%, is used for agriculture. We are growing water-intensive crops like alfalfa and cotton in the middle of deserts, often using century-old, inefficient irrigation methods to feed livestock or export overseas. We are quite literally draining our own survival to grow cattle feed. The laws governing this use, known as the doctrine of prior appropriation, were written in the 19th century. The first person to claim the water gets the rights to it in perpetuity, regardless of how efficiently they use it. It is a system that rewards hoarding, not conservation. Punishing a homeowner in Phoenix for having a small patch of grass while vast desert farms flood irrigate alfalfa fields is not a serious solution. It is a political deflection. The real conversation, the one that politicians and water managers are terrified to have, is about fundamentally rethinking what we grow, where we grow it, and how we value the last remaining drops of water in a drying landscape. Until that conversation happens, we are just plugging holes in a dam that is crumbling from the top down. Every new subdivision and every new alfalfa field is another straw in a drink that is already nearly empty. These 7 lakes are not 7 isolated incidents. They are 7 symptoms of the same disease. A systemic failure born from a century of over-allocation, poor planning, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the limits of a desert environment. We built cities where they shouldn't exist. We planted farms that the climate cannot sustain. We made promises with water that the rivers could never keep. And for 100 years, we got away with it. The Great Salt Lake, Lake Mead, Lake Powell, the Salton Sea, Walker Lake, Elephant Butte, and Medina Lake are the bill coming due. Federal intervention, like the billion-dollar proposal for the Great Salt Lake, or the $250 million for the Salton Sea, feels like a monumental response. But in reality, it may only be a public fund to manage the decline. Money to suppress toxic dust so millions aren't sickened. Money to compensate farmers for water they can no longer take. Money, in essence, to pay for the funeral of an ecosystem. This is no longer about saving these lakes in their historic form. It is now a desperate exercise in disaster mitigation. How do we keep Salt Lake City from becoming an arsenic-laced dust bowl? How do we keep the lights on in California when Hoover Dam goes quiet? These are the questions now being asked inside the Bureau of Reclamation and in state houses across the West. They are no longer questions of growth, but of survival. The engineering marvels of the 20th century, the dams and aqueducts that made the West possible, were all built on one foundational assumption: the water would be there. That assumption is now broken. The paleoclimate record, read through tree rings and sediment cores, shows that the American West has endured mega-droughts that lasted for decades, far more severe than the 20-year dry spell we have just experienced. What our hydrology models saw as a worst-case anomaly could in fact be a return to the region's natural, much drier, baseline. We may have built our entire civilization during an unusually wet period, an aberration, and now nature is simply reverting to the mean. If that is true, then no canal, no dam, and no tunnel can stop what's coming. The stories of these 7 lakes are a final warning. They show us what happens when the water runs out, not in a model, but in reality. Economies collapse, towns become ghosts, the air itself can become toxic. We have pushed the system to its breaking point, and now the system is beginning to break. The 2028 deadline for the Great Salt Lake is not just a deadline for Utah, it is a deadline for all of us. A final call to recognize that we cannot engineer our way out of a problem that we refuse to solve at its source. The water is gone, and it is not coming back. Not in the way we remember. Not in the way our cities and farms were built to expect. Somewhere, in a dry canyon in Texas, on a toxic shoreline in California, on an empty lake bed in Nevada, the future is already here. The only question left is whether we are willing to see it. If you believe this is a story that absolutely must be heard, you know what to do. The most powerful thing you can do right now is hit subscribe. Join. Medina Lake is disappearing right now, today. Not over a century, not over decades. Now, a lake that once held nearly 255,000 acre-feet of water sits at just 4% capacity. That is not a seasonal low. That is not an unusually dry spell. That is the statistical measurement of a body of water that has fundamentally ceased to exist in any meaningful way. And here is the part that nobody is talking about. It isn't just thirst. The lake is physically leaking. It is draining like a cracked bathtub straight into the ground. A massive engineering marvel from a century ago, built on a fatal geologic flaw. Let us know in the comments if you've ever seen a lake this low. We read every single one. But even that is not the whole story. The real story started 14 years ago, 80 miles to the north, in a small town called Spicewood Beach. The first modern Texas town to hit absolute zero, 100% dry. Its fate is the blueprint for what is coming to the communities around Medina Lake. This isn't a warning, it's a case study. Many people watch our documentaries and get so absorbed in the details they forget to subscribe. If this kind of deep reporting is important to you, please take 1 second to hit that subscribe button. It is the only way we can continue to bring these stories to light. Let's begin. To understand what happens when a community's water supply physically vanishes, you have to go back to January 2012, Spicewood Beach, Texas, an unincorporated community in Burnett County, nestled near the shores of another jewel of the hill country, Lake Travis. For years, residents lived a life defined by water. Then the water went away. The town's wells, which drew from the local water table connected to the lake, started sucking mud. Not low pressure, mud. The taps sputtered, hissed, and then went silent. Spicewood Beach became the first town in Texas to go completely 100% dry. That is not a dramatic phrase. It is a technical reality. The Lower Colorado River Authority, the LECRA, had to declare an emergency. They dispatched massive 7,000-gallon tanker trucks, driving water in every single day, just to fill the town's municipal storage tanks. For the residents, life became a grim arithmetic of survival. Each household was rationed, 50 gallons per day. Kathy Mull, a resident living through the outage, described the uncertainty. 50 gallons a day is all we're allowed per household, she said. It's kind of hard to know where this is going to go and how long this is going to be. 50 gallons. That's enough for a few toilet flushes, a quick shower, washing the dishes. That is the entire budget. Gone was the idea of watering a lawn, washing a car, or any casual use of water that modern life takes for granted. Life was reduced to a daily delivery. The sound of the tanker truck became the sound of survival. That is the precedent. That is the documented, lived reality of what happens when the numbers on a chart become the silence coming from your kitchen faucet. And the conditions that made Spicewood Beach a cautionary tale are now gathering around Medina Lake with an intensity that dwarfs the 2012 drought. Medina Lake was born from a dream, the dream of a French colonial impresario named Henri Castro. In the 1850s, more than half a century before the dam existed, Castro looked out over the Medina River Valley and envisioned an agricultural paradise. He saw the fertile soil, the long growing season, but he knew it lacked the one thing it needed to truly flourish: reliable water. He dreamed of damming the Medina River, but he lacked the capital to make it real. That dream lay dormant for 60 years. Then, in November 1911, construction began. It was a monumental undertaking, a private venture fueled by capitalist ambition, designed to turn the Golden Valley of Medina into a farming empire. For 2 years, an army of workers toiled. They built what was, upon its completion on May 7, 1913, the largest dam in Texas and the fourth largest in the entire United States. A concrete behemoth, 1,580 feet long and soaring 164 feet high. It was an engineering triumph, a symbol of man's power to reshape the Texas landscape. But it was built on a catastrophic mistake. The engineers who selected the site severely underestimated the geology of the Texas Hill Country. The dam was constructed directly on top of highly porous karst limestone, specifically the Glen Rose limestone and the Caner Formation of the Edwards Group. This isn't solid bedrock. This is rock that acts like a sponge, riddled with cracks, fissures, and channels. It is the literal recharge zone for the Edwards Aquifer, the massive underground water system that provides drinking water to nearly 2 million people in San Antonio and Bexar County. For a century, Medina Lake has functioned less like a bucket and more like a leaky funnel. It was a secret everyone knew, a quirk of geography that didn't seem to matter when the rains were plentiful. The original irrigation company went bankrupt. Its successors went bankrupt. Finally, in 1950, the entire asset, the dam, the infrastructure, a project that cost $6 million to build in 1913, was sold at a foreclosure auction. The buyer was the newly formed Bexar Medina Atascosa County's Water Control and Improvement District No. 1, or BMA. The final sale price? $10. A $10 dam, built on a geologic flaw that would, 70 years later, threaten to bankrupt an entire region. The lake is leaking in 2 places, and only one of them is natural. The first leak is the one built into the earth itself. Every day, thousands of acre-feet of water don't evaporate. They simply drain. They drop straight through the porous lake bed, disappearing into the limestone fractures below. A 2024-2025 report by USC's hydrologists Richard N. Slattery, Namjung Choi, and Alan K. Clark finally put hard numbers on this century-old problem, quantifying exactly how much of Medina Lake's water recharges the Edwards and underlying Trinity aquifers. It creates a bizarre and deeply uncomfortable paradox. The very geological crack that is destroying Medina Lake and decimating the lakeside economies of towns like Lake Hills and Bandera is the same crack that is feeding the primary water supply for the massive, sprawling metropolis of San Antonio. San Antonio's water utility, SAWS, doesn't even want the surface water from Medina Lake. They claim its quality is too low to treat. They depend on the aquifer that the lake is involuntarily and disastrously refilling. The slow death of Medina Lake helps keep the taps on for 1.85 million people downstream. And if you think that's a broken system, let us know what you would do to fix it in the comments below. That is the first leak. The second one is entirely man-made. When the BMA releases water from the dam for its agricultural customers, it doesn't travel through modern sealed pipes. It flows through a 312-mile network of unlined earthen dirt canals that are 110 years old. These are not state-of-the-art irrigation channels. They are ditches, and they leak massively. Up to 75% of the water released from the dam never reaches a single crop. 75%. It is lost to seepage into the dry ground and evaporation under the brutal Texas sun. So picture this. You have a lake at 4% capacity, hovering dangerously close to being unusable. You make the decision to release some of that precious, irreplaceable water for farmers, and 3/4 of it vanishes into thin air and dry dirt before it can do any good. It is an act of breathtaking inefficiency, releasing water from a dying lake into a century-old network of dirt ditches that functions as a 312-mile-long sponge. It's not just a drought problem, it's an infrastructure problem, a management problem, a crisis of a system that has not adapted in over 100 years. This slow-motion catastrophe has a name, a technical designation for the point of no return. It's called Deadpool. The term gets thrown around, but it is not dramatic shorthand. It's a precise engineering measurement for a genuinely apocalyptic condition. For Medina Lake, the Deadpool elevation is 912.2 feet. When the water level drops below that mark, it can no longer physically flow out of the lowest outlet in the dam. Gravity stops working. The lake ceases to be a reservoir. It stops being an irrigation source. It stops being a flood control mechanism. It becomes a collection of stagnant, isolated puddles, disconnected from the river system, overheating in the sun, where biological degradation accelerates. The water becomes unusable for any purpose. The multi-million-dollar homes lining its shores become worthless waterfront property, overlooking a toxic mudflat. Medina Lake hit Deadpool status in April 2025. It then fell even further, to a historic all-time low of roughly 2%. For years now, the lake has been functionally dead. As of late May 2026, it sat at exactly 4.0% capacity, an elevation of 977.12 feet. Barely above the dead pool line, but still fundamentally a ghost of itself. A brief flash flood in mid-June 2026, when Red Bluff Creek rejoined the river, pushed the level up about 4 feet to 5.2%. It was a psychological boost, a moment of hope. But it was statistically meaningless. Meteorologists called it a band-aid on 6 years of deep, compounding drought. It solved nothing. Mike Crandall, the owner of Wally's Water Sports in Lake Hills, and a founder of the advocacy group Save Medina Lake, saw the water flowing in. Yesterday, the river was moving from up toward Bandera all the way into the lake, he said, and you could actually see it flowing in. Seeing that water move today gives people out here a little bit of hope. Hope. For a 4-foot rise in a lake that is down over 90 feet. That is the desperation of the situation. People are clinging to any sign of life, no matter how fleeting. Sarah Voss, who owns the Sunset Resort at the lake, has watched her business and her life savings evaporate with the water. The brief rains brought a flicker of optimism, but the fundamental math has not changed. The lake is structurally broken. If you think more people need to understand the scale of this crisis, please hit the like button. And if you have family in Texas or other drought-stricken areas, please share this documentary with them. Getting the word out is the first step. The disappearance of the lake creates a domino effect that is now toppling the region's other water sources. The communities around the lake, like Bandera and Lake Hills, don't just rely on the surface water. They rely on private wells drilled into the aquifers below. With the lake gone, there is less recharge for these local water tables. And with explosive population growth, more and more wells are being drilled, all sucking from the same diminishing supply. They are now drilling into the Lower Trinity Aquifer, a deep, ancient water source. Some of this water is 20,000 years old. It is, for all practical purposes, a non-renewable resource, fossil water, and even those wells are starting to fail. Dave Mauk is the general manager of the Bandera County River Authority and Groundwater District. He is not an activist, he is a water manager staring at the data. And the data terrifies him. This drought is punishing, and it's looking to be worse than the drought in the 50s, he warned the Bandera City Council. The 1950s drought is the stuff of Texas legend, the benchmark for all modern suffering. Mock is saying this is worse. Eventually we will hit a wall here, he said. I implore you all to start looking to the future and conserve as much as you can. His warning was not abstract. Just weeks after the hopeful June rains gave Medina Lake its brief 4-foot bump, the city of Bandera was forced to return to Stage 3 water restrictions because their municipal wells refused to recharge. The Band-Aid had already been ripped off. The wound was still there. The water that fell from the sky was just a momentary illusion. The deep groundwater, the water they depend on to survive day to day, was still disappearing. This is the Spicewood Beach scenario playing out in slow motion. The town of Bandera is not at 100% dry. Not yet, but the trajectory is clear. The arithmetic is brutal. When your deep, reliable wells stop recovering, you are on a countdown. The only question is how long it will last. Compounding all of this is a situation of such institutional absurdity, it would be comical if it weren't so devastating. A legal battle between the two biggest players in the region, the BMA, who owns the $10 dam, and the San Antonio Water System, SAWS. For years, SAWS has been locked into a contract that forces them to pay the BMA $3 million annually. For what? For 19,974 acre-feet of water from Medina Lake. Water that SAWS says is of such low quality, it's not worth treating. Water that, in recent years, often doesn't even exist. SAWS doesn't want the water. They don't use the water, but they have to pay for it. In October 2023, SAWS had enough. They filed a lawsuit entering aggressive litigation to terminate the contract once and for all. They argue it's an obsolete agreement that forces their ratepayers to subsidize a failing water system for water they will never receive. The BMA's response reveals the true nature of the trap. In 2022, the BMA used the guaranteed $3 million annual payment from SAWS as collateral to back $12 million in new bonds. They leveraged a hostile contract with a partner who was actively trying to sue them, locking SAWS into a financial embrace it desperately wants to escape. The two entities are now legally shackled together in a standoff. SAWS is forced to fund the very organization it sees as mismanaging the resource, while the BMA depends on that funding for its own survival. And while the lawyers argue, the lake continues to disappear. The 312 miles of earthen canals continue to leak. The systemic problems remain unaddressed, frozen by litigation and institutional inertia. A group of frustrated residents and business owners formed the organization Save Medina Lake, a 5014 advocacy group. They are not waiting for the lawsuit. They are petitioning the Texas Sunset Advisory Commission, a state body that reviews the efficiency of government agencies, to force state oversight onto the BMA. They argue the BMA has operated for a century with almost no accountability, and the result is a dead lake and a dying regional economy. They are fighting an uphill battle against a political subdivision that has been entrenched for generations. It is a fight over who controls the water, or what's left of it. I know, I'm probably asking a second time, but seeing the numbers on our end, it's genuinely how we survive. So many people find value in this reporting but forget to subscribe. If you have made it this far into the details, you are not a casual viewer. Please, take 1 second and join us. It makes all the difference. What does the future look like? There are no easy answers. The history of the lake since 2014 offers a grim preview. In May 2014, the lake dropped to a then historic low of roughly 3%. It looked like the end. Then, in May 2015, a miracle. The wettest May on record in Texas history arrived. Storm after storm rolled through the hill country, unleashing biblical floods. The drought was broken, spectacularly. Lakes across the state filled up. Medina Lake recovered. For a moment, it seemed the cycle was reset. The crisis was over. It was an intermission. The underlying problems, the geological leak, the inefficient canals, the relentless growth in population, the warming climate, none of them went away. The memory of rain faded. The dry years returned, one after another, each one digging the water debt a little deeper. 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025. By April 2025, the lake was back at dead pool, lower than it had ever been before. The Great Flood of 2015 was erased. The recovery was gone. Now, in 2026, The lake sits at the bottom of that long decline. The 4-foot rise from a June rainstorm was a blip. A momentary spike on a graph that is still trending towards zero. The drainage basin that feeds the lake is only 634 square miles. It is simply too small to keep a reservoir of this size full during the kind of multi-year, systemic droughts that are becoming the new normal in Texas. The water managers know this. The residents know this. The business owners who have watched their livelihoods dry up know this. They are trapped between a flawed past and an uncertain future. Trapped by the decisions made by engineers in 1911 who picked the wrong spot. Trapped by the inefficiency of a water district that won the dam for $10 and has operated it the same way ever since. Trapped by a climate that no longer delivers the rain they once took for granted. Stand on the edge of what was once Medina Lake. Look at the exposed bluffs, the vast plains of cracked mud dotted with mesquite trees where people used to water ski. Look at the boat docks, sitting hundreds of yards from the water's edge, like stranded skeletons. Look at the waterline stains on the cliffs high above, a ghostly reminder of where the water used to be. That stain isn't ancient history. It's living memory. That is the visual record of what has been lost. It's what happens when a natural cycle of drought collides with a century of human error. Medina Lake is not just a victim of the weather. It is a casualty of its own design. The story of Spicewood Beach in 2012 was a singular event, a shocking first. A town's wells going dry felt like a freak occurrence. It is not a freak occurrence anymore. It is a template. The communities clinging to the shores of Medina Lake are watching their own wells struggle. They are watching their property values collapse. They are watching their future evaporate into the hot Texas sky and seep into the ground beneath their feet. The question is no longer if another Texas town will go 100% dry.